Green River Killer, featuring Gary Ridgway. Full name, Gary Leon Ridgway. Crimes and sprees. Gary was known to be the responsible killer of 49 murders in Green River, King County, Washington. He would specifically target and murder females who were either runaways or sex workers, though he would reportedly target females in the streets. It was reported he would target females who were easily not reported as missing, in other words, vulnerable individuals. Following the murders, Gary would dump the corpses of the victims in the Green River. In addition, he would engage in necrophiliac activities with the corpses. Other than murder, it was reported when Gary was young, he stabbed a boy and drowned him in a lake. However, the boy had survived. The killing spree had lasted from 1982 to 1998, nearly spanned 20 years. There were years when the killings reached its peak. However, there were other years when the killings began to slow down in rate. Investigation. The investigation of Gary was one of America's longest, largest, and most expensive serial murder investigation. It was reported 40 detectives were hired, along with FBI profilers and forensic analysts. 20 years had passed, and the serial killer for the Green River murders wasn't caught. One day, investigators began to receive letters by ironically serial killer Ted Theodore Robert Caldwell Bundy, another name Ted Bundy, claiming he would help with the case, who, by the way, was incarcerated in Florida's death row. Ted correctly identified the serial killer was a necrophiliac. In addition, it was likely he would dump bodies in a certain area continuously. Actually, even throughout the investigation, Gary was interviewed many times. However, he claimed to not know the victims. In addition, he would even pass the lie detector, causing the police to look elsewhere and not suspect Gary for the crimes. Even a DNA test was taken in place. However, it did not work. They would also investigate the truck Gary would drive. However, due to the fact they seemingly overlooked the evidence of Gary, they would miss major samples. Years later, one day in 2001, a DNA sample connected to Gary from 1987 with the help of modern and advanced technology. Gary was arrested on November 30, 2001 in his workplace at Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton, Washington. Trial and court proceedings. Gary would not follow through a standard criminal trial. He accepted a massive historic plea bargain. Based on the criminal case and the crimes he committed, it was highly likely for Gary to receive death penalty. However, the prosecutors have realized without the help of Gary, the victims would likely never be found. Therefore, the prosecutors would create a deal. If Gary would lead them to where he dumped the bodies, the death penalty would be taken away from this case. He would be put in a room full of maps and books and get interviewed with investigators that would eventually lead to the discovery of the bodies and corpses of the victims. On November 5, 2003, Gary officially stood in Seattle courtroom to plead guilty. The proceeding was flat, chilling and clinical demeanor from Gary. The jury decided for the families of the victims to have the chance to express their emotions to Gary, which includes anger, grief, and pain. However, throughout all the strong emotions, one victim's father, who goes by Robert Rule, showed the opposite demeanor. He forgave Gary in front of the whole courtroom. It made Gary go into tears, likely because of the humane words Robert had said. At the end of the court, in King County Superior Court, Judge Richard Jones, with a harsh tone, sentenced Gary to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In addition, an extra 480 years for evidence tampering. Childhood. The childhood of Gary was marked by deeply dysfunctional environments, along with a violent household and sexual confusing relationships with certain members in his family. He was born between his father, Tom Ridgway, and his mother, Mary Rita. Both parents would often have arguments involving screaming and yelling whenever either Gary or his siblings made some sort of mistake or form of mistake. They would be spanked with a hard metal stick or a leather belt. His relationship between him and his father lacked a sense of genuineness. They barely communicated, and whenever they would, it would just be a screaming match between Tom, the father of Gary, and Gary's mother, Mary. On the other hand, with his mother would beat him up, hit him, sexually assault Gary, show her private areas, tell him stories about sexual relationships with her clients, and even have sex with Gary himself. The relationship created a complex emotion towards his mother, due to the fact he hated his mother for the abuse. However, he grew a sexual attraction towards his mother. Gary would release urine in his bed even when he was 13 years old, leading to his mother often washing his genitals inappropriately, also humiliating Gary in front of his siblings. He began to set fires around his neighborhood, along with torturing animals. It was reported, though ignored by the police, Gary stabbed a boy. Childhood, Part 2. Later on, he would confess he did stab the boy, due to the fact he wanted to sense how it felt, what was it like to kill. Overall, there were many notable unstable conditions and relationships, along with an unfortunate environment in Gary's childhood life. Personal life, potentially affecting their crimes and acts. The personal life of Gary was structured with an unstable sexual marriages, but also had a stable and seemingly normal job. The first two marriages Gary had was with Claudia Barrows and Marcia Winslow. Both marriages were unstable, structured with either Gary cheating on them or sexually controlling them. However, with his third marriage, it was considered to be the most successful marriage out of the three. She went by Judith Lynch. She wasn't aware of her husband being a serial killer, and once that news was heard, she became heartbroken and very shocked. Every Sunday he would go to church, and in secret he would try to cover up his dark secret of the murders. In addition to ease his guilt on murdering a horrendous amount of individuals. For 30 years, he worked as a truck painter in a factory and was well known by every employee. He seemed reliable and had a nice male to work with. It was reported there was this one occasion Gary would leave his victim's corpse in the trunk as he drove with his son to school, while the corpse rotted in the back of the trunk. When people rode his truck, due to the fact his son's toys were scattered around the seat, also leaving the child's seat, it made it easier for anyone to not suspect Gary as a Green River killer, due to the fact they would think he was a good father. Pivotal events. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on the 18th of February, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. His family and Gary moved to SeaTac area of Washington State in 1960. From 1949 to 1969, he academically struggled at school. In addition, he was abused and sexually assaulted from his mother. Gary first married Claudia Barrows from 1970 to 1972. Gary had his second marriage with Marcia Winslow between 1978 to 1980. On July 15, 1982, his first victim was discovered in Green River, Washington. On May of 1984, Gary passed the lie detector test, letting him get away with the murders for the next few decades. On April 8, 1987, Gary's hair was used as a DNA evidence, though it was dismissed and stored away. Gary had his final and third marriage with Judith Lynch between 1988 to 2001. On November 30, 2001, Gary was arrested for his murders. On November 5, 2003, Gary pled guilty to 48 murders, eventually turning into 49 with the help of DNA evidence in his confession. Quotes from Gary Leon Ridgway. I'm a murderer, not a rapist. Do I look like the Green River Killer? I pull it really hard on her neck, just like this. Don't fight, and I will let you go. I drove my pickup and parked a little over the hill. Yes, it is. Yes, it is true. Guilty. Yes. Well, one of them was, as I would get her in the car, she is in the car, driving down the road. First, she wants to see my ID, so I whipped out my ID, and with my ID would be I put my finger over the driver's license to hide my name, but on the opposite side was pictures, and a picture of my son, and they would see my son, and they would know I was probably a normal person. Quotes, Part 2. This quote will be from one of Gary's victims' father, Robert Rule, a gentleman who would dress up as a Santa Claus in malls to help children. In addition, he would attend church every Sunday to support his religion. Mr. Ridgway, there are people here who hate you. I'm not one of them. I forgive you for what you have done. You have made it difficult to live up to what I believe and what God says to do, and that is to forgive. And he doesn't say to forgive certain people. He says to forgive all. So you are forgiven, sir. Gary began to cry after hearing the words, the most humane words of Mr. Robert. Forensic inferences. In the life of Gary, it seems there were many failures within relationships, specifically towards females. Aside from his third marriage, it seems throughout his life, he seemed to grow some sort of hatred, but also desires towards females, specifically a sexual desire to control them and make out with them. It's likely whenever he would take the lives of the victims, such as strangling them, he would remember his mother, whom he had both a sexual attractions and hate towards. He was sexually harassed by his mother, feeling a sense of arousal, of hatred, along with desires to do it himself. His red flags, such as torture towards animals, seemed to have been ignored, growing a sense of normality to him. While he knew the difference between right and wrong, the desire, similar to other serial killers, likely gotten the best of him. He might have had really some sort of fear on receiving the death penalty, so he would plead guilty to all murders. It was likely the emotion of relief on not getting the death penalty led him to plead guilty on all murders, rather than genuine or strong sense of remorse, even if he had felt some partial emotions of it. It's likely Gary did not support or like Ted Bundy, especially after Ted helped the investigators with catching Gary. Overall, the killings Gary had made was a combination of his childhood, his ignored red flags, and the negative relationship with females. Legacy and impact. The case of Gary Leon Ridgway helped with the advancement of forensic science technology. People had suspected Gary might have surpassed Ted Bundy for the amount of victims he murdered. FBI and authorities began to realize the unsuspecting persona of serial killers. Gary was one of the rare serial killers who spared the death penalty, especially from his horrendous amount of crimes. The public began to outrage due to the spare the court made for Gary. The victims' families of Gary Leon Ridgway today are creating a model for victim advocacy.